Hello, and thank you for joining me on Operation History, Episode 1.1, My Joy, My Pride. Now, my name is Brandon, and I'll be your guide through the lesser knowns of history. With all that said, I believe it's time. So let's learn something together, eh? In planning and thinking up the first topic for the show, I was filled with story ideas, many of which I'm sure we'll get to as time goes on because, hey, they were good ideas. But behind all the topics, the vagary of history kept striking me. A great man to one is a monster to another. A movement that millions died to create is abhorrent to the rest of the world. This kept pushing my metaphorical pen back and forth between topics. And then when looking at my list of potential topics, I realized I kept coming back to doing a biography series first. And I was excited and nervous, and quite frankly, still am. But the reasons behind this is threefold. One, the man and his life were incredibly interesting and important as far as the course of our world is concerned, which made me excited. As for being nervous, I stated previously, a great man to some is a monster to others. But as anyone who would have been alive to tell me if he truly was a monster are long dead, and nothing I've read leads me to believe he was, I think we're good to go. And lastly, being true to my mission statement, I don't think most of you know who this guy is. So let me start this off with a question. Do you ever watch a movie or TV show and the main character just seems like his life is too fantastical to be believable? Just part of everything going on, everyone likes him, always seems to win, smart, talented, with a backlog of stories that put anything you could say to shame? Well, I'm here to tell you about an interesting man whose life could be turned into a blockbuster movie. You know, that guy. At this point, I'm sure some of you are thinking Teddy Roosevelt. Good guess, but no, come on. I told you all that we are exploring the lesser known side of history. Obviously, Teddy Roosevelt's not lesser known, so guess a little bit more obscure, will you? Alright, got a guess? Good. Now with all this talk of great men in history, I'm sure each of you had a guess jump right to the front of your minds. Think of this guy. Was he a leader of men? A general, an author, an explorer, an innovator, or maybe you just thought of your dad, and if that's where your mind went, you were a good son or daughter and should call your dad. Tell him you love him. I digress. With all that being said, the man I chose fits all of those criteria. Well, other than being your dad, that is. One quick note before we get started. As I don't speak German, I am sure I will butcher the pronunciation of many of the names and places, so I truly apologize in advance. Okay, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's meet the man. His name, Helmuth Karl Bernhard Graf von Moltke, born October 26, 1800, in Parchim, Mecklenburg-Schwerin, to Friedrich Philipp Victor von Moltke and his mother, Sophie Henriette Paschen. He was the third child of 6 sons: Wilhelm, Friedrich, Helmuth, Adolf, Ludwig, and Victor, in order of birth. Now, I could go on for days about his family history, but here are just the bullet points. They are of lower noble stock, hence the von in their name. They go back hundreds of years in the Prussian Denmark region of Europe, and they had mostly made their names in service to the military. So, as I said, he was born in the Prussian state, but when he was just 5 years old, his family bought an estate in Augustenhof in the Duchy of Holstein. With this move, they became subjects of the Danish crown. A year after their move, the French and Prussian armies fought a battle basically in their backyard. Their house was looted, they lost 14 horses, and the rest of their farm just burnt to the ground. Now, these losses necessitated Friedrich, Helmuth's father, to find an income to support his family, as obviously his estate and farming wasn't going to do the trick. To this end, he got a commission from King Christian VII of Denmark and made a major in the Dutch army. At this point, the Dutch were fighting the English, and Friedrich distinguished himself as a commander. The king even recognized him personally by saying, "Your behavior has been a matter of rejoicing to me and the whole of my royal house. I shall not forget it." And in fact, he never did. So, with an income for the family secured, we can now get to the man of the story, Helmuth. For his first few years, there's not a lot to talk about, as he was a toddler, and hey, not much interesting happens then. But when he was 9 years old, his father sent him with two of his brothers, Wilhelm and Fritz, to Pastor Nickelbein at Hoffenfeld in Holstein for an early education. There, Helmuth passed his time between his studies by building intricate little fortresses. Now, I know when I was a kid, I built forts out in the woods or in the snow, but he took things to a whole different level. Helmuth's father, wanting to encourage his son's military leanings, bought for Helmuth 2 small, actual cannons for his forts. Now, would you trust a 9-year-old with 2 real cannons? I sure as hell wouldn't. I mean, most of us played with G.I. Joes or video games, maybe even Nerf guns. But real cannons? I think not. But if you consider this, I think it's important to note that these were the toys, quote unquote, he played with in his youth. Cannons. It was after these events that his father remembered years later. I did not think then that this son 40 years later was destined to be my joy, my pride, and my benefactor, and that such a rare life was before him, surrounded by so many perils. Sounds like we found Daddy's favorite a bit, doesn't it? I'd hate to be one of his brothers at the von Moltke's family dinners. Yeah, awkward. But moving on. Now, 2 years after being sent to Holstein, Helmuth and his brother Fritz were sent to the Landkadetten. Landkadetten? I think that's about right. Landkadetten Academy of Copenhagen. There, he was to live with General Lorenz. Helmuth remembers his time at the academy as dull, strict, even harsh, and he became used to many privations. Under these conditions, he got sick quite often with fevers, and once even with the measles. But even under these circumstances, young Helmuth thrived and focused hard upon his studies. Once, in 1813, Helmuth's father came to Copenhagen to take him and his brother back to Holstein for a vacation. One evening, on their trip back, they got into a small boat to cross the Great Belt. If you don't know, the Great Belt is the largest strait in Denmark. It divides 2 of the islands by a stretch of about 10 to 20 miles of water. Easily passable now by bridge, but back then you definitely needed to take a boat. But, as it so happened, when they got out in the water, they spotted 3 British men-of-war patrolling the waterway, looking for easy prey. The Moltkes slipped past the warships within spitting distance. Thankfully for everyone involved, no English sailor happened to look over the sides and saw the 3 men in their little boat cruising right past them, as this would not have been much of a fight, and the English sure would have had a nice prize in Friedrich. Anyway, safely ashore and on their way to Augustenhof. When close to the homestead, the brothers got out of the carriage and hid underneath it. When the mother came out to greet the carriage, the young cadets were nowhere to be seen. She ordered the carriage put away in the barn, slightly frustrated. Once the carriage was out of sight, the 2 sneaky brothers dropped from their hiding places, ran around the back of the house, slipped in the back door, fixed their uniforms, and stood at attention in the dining room, waiting to be found. I'm sure when they finally were found, this came as a great surprise to their mother. 2 young cadets, smartly dressed, standing at attention, must have been a shock. Now, at this time at the academy in 1817, he was made a page by the King of Denmark. And then finally, in 1818, he passed his final officer's examination, of which he was the top of his class. The commander of the cadets, Friedrich Glode Juplat, stated that, and I read straight from his January 1st, 1819 report, Helmuth Karl Bernhard von Moltke has conducted himself as benefits a young soldier who wishes to join the army as officer, for which he possesses the necessary qualifications. In his examination for an officer, he received 103 good marks, 22 fair, and 6 bad ones, and has hereby gained the best certificate for the military subordinate commands. In consequence, the diploma for an officer has been granted him by His Majesty the King. At the same time, he has successfully passed examination as page. Helmuth received his commission as second lieutenant on January 20th, and in 1819 he left from his long stay at the academy in Copenhagen and went to Rendsburg to join the Oldenburg Infantry Regiment. A year later, he was transferred to a distinguished rifle brigade. He served this time as a second lieutenant with nothing much to report. In 1821, Friedrich came and took Helmuth to Berlin, as they both happened to be on leave at the time. It was here that young Helmuth first saw the Prussian army. He was so impressed that he had no other wish than to join and serve in this great fighting force. So to this end, he submitted a letter to the chief of his regiment and to the Duke to resign his post and ask permission to enter the Prussian force. Both of his requests were granted, but there was a bit of a hang-up. He had to complete the entrance exam for the Prussian military service in 2 days. Studying for only the 2 days he had, he passed his test and was now entered into the Prussian army in 1822. At this point, he was the youngest and the 29th second lieutenant in the Royal Regiment of Infantry, garrisoned at Frankfurt on the Oder. In 1823, he found out he was accepted and entered in the Kriegsschule War Academy at Berlin. This was exceptional, as he was still so young at the time, and this was a very, very prestigious school, almost unheard of someone at his age getting accepted. While at the War College, he excelled and really enjoyed the lectures of Major von Kaunitz on the history of war, geography as taught by Professor Ritter, and physics by Professor Ehrman. It is also important to note that while there, he had to scrimp and save what little pay he got from his service so he could afford to live while taking classes. Normally, most students just drew upon their families or their own personal wealth and lived pretty luxuriously. But as his father could not afford to help in any great way, as the family's fortunes were gone due to the war and bad misfortunes, so instead of living large and going out with his friends, he buckled down and studied. This reminds me of having to work and go to classes myself in college while subsisting on a diet of ramen and cheap fast food. I'm sure many of you can relate. Even though he was low on funds, he saw fit to add additional classes. He chose to take foreign language. In this pursuit, he also showed great aptitude. His love and skill in all these areas of study will follow him for the rest of his career and greatly affected the rest of his life. Upon graduating from the War Academy in Berlin in July of 1826, his teachers, including Clausewitz, yes, that Karl von Clausewitz, if you don't know who he is, look him up. Really interesting guy. But I digress. Helmuth's professors had this to say about him. The above named has written good essays on the practical military subjects given. The result of his scientific studies has been very good. His conduct was blameless. Herewith is certified the accordance of this certificate with the opinions of the masters and superiors whose names are in the class books. Board of Directors of Military and Other Studies of the War Academy. Signed, Clausewitz, Thule von Lillenstern, E.G. Fischer, and Postgler. Now, that takes us through the first 26 years of Helmuth's life. And it's already been crazy up to this point, with his adventures and already being a commissioned officer for 2 different powers, a graduate of the Dutch Military Academy, not to mention a well-received and respected graduate of one of the most, if not the most, prestigious military academies of its time, the Kriegsschule War Academy in Berlin. But this is all just backstory for the true adventures and achievements on the horizon. Thank you for joining me on this first long episode of Operation History. I truly hope you enjoyed yourselves listening half as much as I did producing it. Join me next time as we follow Helmuth on the next leg of his journey that will take him from Silesia to Vienna, on to Constantinople, and beyond throughout Asia Minor and the Middle East all the way to the gates of Egypt. Please like, comment, and subscribe so you're alerted when the next episode is released. And as always, let's learn something together.